Welcome back to part 2 of our conversation with young writer Isha Merchant, whose book The Swing we are talking about. And it's a fictionalized narrative of a real story about her great-grandmother and her journey through life. Isha has done a wonderful job of doing research and bringing up what is a beautifully narrated story. Isha, sometimes I felt that your pen was like a brush. You were painting a beautiful picture, or so that's the power of words, because there are moments in the book where I felt I'm watching or viewing a painting rather than reading a book.
Thank you so much, sir. That's the biggest compliment I can think of.
Thank you. So we left in the previous part with the story of Fatima neighborhood, the importance of human relations over however ethnically born we are by accident of birth, and engage those identities of language, religion, and places. And you make a case through that nice narrative about how such human relations go beyond, transcend those humanly defined boundaries of caste, creed, religion. And you actually argue that those need not be the defining characteristics of human relationships.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. So I was in one of the chapters, you called it the Gandheri. Now that's a Sindhi word, Gandheri, which took me back to my childhood of growing up in one of the Sindhi refugee camps in Gujarat, where these cart pullers will bring sugarcane, small pieces on slabs of ice. And in summer, that used to be delight to go for that. And you don't miss even the small part of putting rose water on it. So there's a story about Padma and Teumal, about Gandheri. In Sindhi, we would call Gandheri. Ga is one of the 4 unique Sindhi sounds in phonetics. Ga. There's others are ba and nga and ya. So ga is, and it's called gero. This is called gero. So ga. Although in English you can't mention that, so you use Gandheri. Talk about Gandheris.
This story about Gandhiri, it was told by my grandmother in very vivid detail. I have never seen or tasted Gandhiri, and the description which you provided actually brought very vivid images to my mind. My mother had also mentioned that this was one of my great grandmother's favorites, and this was one of the small joys of life, I think. And I would also like to ask, sir, as a Sindhi, how would you relate to Gandhiri? Because obviously now in the present world, we don't really see it as much as I think they saw it back then. A very it was a familiar thing, and I have never heard of or seen this before.
Yeah, I mean, see, street food is a new thing, which is processed street food is new thing in contemporary society. So when you feel hungry, you go for a snack on a eating joint somewhere in Bangalore or wherever. But most of that food is processed. And hence with it comes all kinds of, not just the consequences for health, but also for environment. The more processing we do, more damage we do to the environment. But so we were lucky to have very little processed food, but more raw food. So whether it is the roasted peanuts or Gandheri, which is a sugar cane, basically. So in the harvesting season for sugarcane, some cart pullers who did vending on the carts in the streets will carry a lot of wild fruits like berries and other fruits and vegetables, even tomatoes. So tomatoes were quite often cut into small pieces. They were put on piece of ice, and along with that you would get these Gandheris, which are small chopped one inch long pieces of sugar cane, raw sugar cane, and peeled obviously, and then On top of it, they would sprinkle rose water. And I remember seeing rose petals on the ice slab. And then in summer, when you are out and about on the street, it's hot, and then it comes as a great sense of relief and delight to have something sweet. And it's similar to the what do you call the ice balls that we put a lot of syrups on the street, which you get these days also on the high street or in the eating joints. So it was the joy of just being on the street, and we were all like wild children on the streets all the time playing. And these wild fruits came along, and they kind of complemented our sports on the street when you are sweating and dirty, and then this thing comes along and you take 5-minute break and have that. It just gives you the, I can see why Padma and Teumal just delight in the joy of having that together, because that indeed was the absolute pleasure. It was heavenly, as you put it in the book.
I really wish I could have tasted this. Maybe one day I will have some version of this. But definitely, I think vivid stories that come from many people who have tasted this, maybe that is satisfactory.
Yes. And then there's another, in a different context, it looked like a small pleasure of life to have a pingo or a swing in the house. But here it is quite serious. It is quite important to Padma to have her own pingo. Now, pingo, again, historically, since being generally a warm place, swings had also functional purpose, because not everybody could afford electric fans and so on. So pingo was also one way of, rather than having somebody swing fans set to you, you sit on a pingo which swings, and then basically you get a little bit of breeze around in the drawing room or wherever you are sitting, or in veranda. So swing was a kind of a brilliant invention to kind of move yourself rather than ask somebody else to move a fan around you. And it served that purpose, the joy of, and of course it has got a kind of mythical connotations about Jhula of Krishna, and and goes with the cradle kind of metaphor as well. But it would be wonderful if you could go to that chapter, because I think the profundity, the depth of the experience of those small pleasures and how they contribute to our happiness as a human being is captured in the chapter where you talk about Pingo. So would you like to read something for the listeners?
Sure, certainly. I think this chapter comes towards the end, and this is the chapter where Padma and Teumal finally fulfill their small but at the same time, I would say, big dream because of getting a pingo, because I think that symbolized their improved financial situation in the family. So the chapter's name is It's Ours to Leave Behind. Carefully, carefully, Teumal cried for about the umpteenth time that evening, voicing Padma's worries. 1 week had passed and the day had come. It was the day when their swing, their pingo, would come home. The day passed in a blur of anticipation and excitement. The thrill and enthusiasm were palpable, and to any passers-by who didn't know what was happening, they would have probably guessed that the preparations for a wedding celebration was going on in the house. The 4 children were excited and anxious, running out the door every 10 seconds to make sure that the swing hadn't come yet, and if it had, no one had stolen it. No matter how many times Padma patiently explained that no one would be able to pick up the swing and waltz away with it, as it possibly weighed more than all of them combined, they were not swayed. At some point, she gave up, realizing the futility of arguing with children, and let herself also be lost in the excited ruckus. When it had finally arrived, the moment was surreal. The swing, their pingo, a gorgeous masterpiece. It was an ornate wooden carved pingo with several artfully and patiently engraved designs, slivers of mirrors embedded on the surface that glinted every time sunlight touched it, a soft mattress with which they covered with a special bedcloth embroidered with patient hands. The children gawped at it as the men who had come to install the pingo precariously tottering whenever they were overbalancing, and a cry of panic issued from the throats of the entire household. At last, the pingo was placed in the corner of the courtyard. It was truly massive, Padma thought, as they clambered on the swing. First her and all the children. They giggled as they examined all the intricate carvings. Why are there only flowers in this part, Bhabhi? Ramesh pouted, prodding one of the carvings. Krishna stuck her tongue out at him. Because it looks prettier than a Rakshas, she said, referring to mythical monsters. Ramesh had particularly enjoyed a scary story about a Rakshas a few nights ago and had taken it upon himself to scare whoever was coming through the door. Padma gave them a pointed look, and the bickering quickly subsided. At last, the swing rocked a little, to and fro, and they all sat on it, enjoying the little breeze that whispered in their ears. She gave a little contented sigh. But Bhabhi, said Krishna, even my friend in school has a pingo. What's so special about this one? Almost all my friends have one. Padma smiled and brushed some of Krishna's hair out of her eyes. Because this one is ours, Krishna.
It's beautiful, isn't it? The last few sentences, you talk about she brushed few hair of Krishna's eyes. Again, that's what I meant by painting a picture rather than writing. I could visualize how a mother is caressing her daughter on the forehead, removing the hair, which is very common sight, which you see mothers doing. And that's where the beauty of your writing was.
Thank you so much.
So it is then obviously story progresses, India becomes independent, but it was not a simple event for people who were on the both sides of new boundaries that were being drawn. And you write very movingly about how those boundaries are being drawn without much concern for the human consequences. And you narrate some very tragic events, but also for this family, it becomes a big dilemma what to do. So reflect for us a little bit about that dilemma they were facing of whether to stay in Rohri in Sindh, where they were very well settled, first time feeling a sense of we got our home, now something of our own. Temal is doing very well on the work, but now they are facing this dilemma. And they had to convince Amma also.
Yes, as you said, sir, perhaps for the first time in many, many years, since Padma had gotten married, they felt financially stable in Sindh, in their house. And they had established their home, and of course, the coming of the Pinghu at home, which only, I think, cemented the fact that they were beginning to accept that house as their home. And then came the partition, and they knew that they would soon be forced to leave. But there were so many problems that came in. Firstly, how were they to take some of their savings and belongings to India? And how were they to convince the elder sister-in-law, Amma? I particularly feel that the decision was a very difficult one, but soon they were motivated by pure survival to move into India. And I suppose that this is the story for many other partition survivors as well. Yes, I think so.
Yeah, and then they did indeed convince Amma, they move, and there is a very tense period of travel via steamer, and they come to Navlakhi, which is in Kutch actually. And I've been to Navlakhi port myself, not came from there, but I worked for some time in Kutch. and I have visited Nowlakhi Port, and it brought back for me the landscape of that place, which is a very deserted place. It's a desert. Kutch is a desert, and that coast of Gujarat on that side. So probably they traveled from Karachi to that side, and very near to that is the westernmost point of Indian landmass, and you can actually see if you go in bright enough, dark enough night, you could see the lights on the other side of border in Pakistan, Karachi side. From there, so they come there, and then you talk about the difficulties. They come to Pulgam in Maharashtra, and there's a beautiful chapter, although it is talking of the difficulties and hardships, but you give it a very interesting twist in chapter titled 10,002 Seconds. I really enjoyed reading that how a child is processing the experience and reflecting on it. And there's a lot in that chapter for me that I really enjoyed reading about a child, because most of that book is about Temal and Padma, but here you bring in a child and give us a view from how they are experiencing 10,002 seconds. Would you like to talk about those numbers?
Arguably, that was one of my favorite chapters to write in the book, and a favorite with my family as well. Temal and Padma's story was very important, but also I think important was how the younger generation was trying to cope up with the concept of partition. In this chapter, I have taken the viewpoint of a fictional boy, Hemu, who has just lost his mother to the riots of partition and is now safely in India with his father, whom he does not have as close a relationship with as his mother. But eventually, he realizes that there is still hope in a new country, despite the loss of his mother and the loss of the home that he had lived in all his life. There was hope in a new country, and I believe that I end the chapter with them going by the lake, where the father would take him to play with the other children. I think the partition also brought with it some hope, even in my great grandmother's story.
Yeah, and then this 10,000 is what? 10,000 is they're waiting in a queue.
Yes. While I was researching for the book, one of the most famous pictures that I came across was a line of people just waiting for water, and the line stretched for over a kilometer. And they mentioned, one of the survivors mentioned that they would have to wait about 3 hours just to get a few pots of water. And I think 10,000 seconds about would translate to almost that period of time. And for them waiting that long in line just to get that water, it was true grit, and I would say survival and a will to live. Also, I think the fact that it was seconds is probably because Hemu was counting the amount of time until which they would get the pots of water, and 10,000 is such a huge number. So there are a couple of aspects to that.
Yeah, and then within 2 seconds, whole thing is over, because you fill up a couple of your pictures and then you're done while you waited for 10,000 seconds.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's a beautifully narrated. Again, it took me back to some of my young days, because when I was growing, we were a very large joint family of 13, 14 people, including my siblings, under one roof. And pipe water had not reached the camp probably until late 70s or early 80s. So there was a public space where you would go. There were 7, 8 taps, and everybody from the neighborhood would go to fill there. And water would come only at certain times of the day, every day. So we used to literally queue or leave our buckets in queue, and my grandma would tell me, go and stand by, as people don't move your bucket back, and so on. So it wasn't 10,000, but it was, little fights over who gets first water and so on. Brought those some memories back to us, which so you can see how long the impact lasted in some areas. I'm talking of late 70s, mid 70s, and partition had happened in 1947. So good 25, 30 years, there were consequences that Sindhi families suffered, those who got dispersed all over. And obviously some of the consequences are very difficult to repair, like disbursement of people means disbursement of the ability to congregate. And if you can't congregate, you can't speak the language. Recently I did an interview with Professor Ganesh Devi, who was talking about 800 people is a knot in the linguistic or in anthropology, where 800 people, when they are together, they speak the language, the vocabulary survives, the language survives, and so on. Although we were a large camp, so I think that way we survived. But it meant that a lot of other things could not be done, like education, because everybody was trying, as this young man in the story, as they were growing, their priority was to survive, and therefore you prioritize. But going back to Padma, she doesn't want to compromise on the education of children.
Yes, she, one of the first things I believe was told to me, one of the first things that she had done once they had a footing in the new country was they enrolled their children in the local school in Pulgaon. And from there, they did have very good, successful lives, I would say. That was one thing Bhabi would never compromise on, education. And she never has.
Yeah, and it is paying off. It paid off through your grandmother, your mother being educated, and of course now you. I mean, in a way, I was reflecting on someone of your age in 1933, a girl growing up, and the kind of challenges socially she faced, and for her the need to argue that she needed to be educated. It was her right to be educated. Today, you don't face those things. Actually, you will be encouraged to do that. So that's the bit of progress, isn't it?
Yes, and definitely my great grandmother was very brave and very progressive. I think it's because of her encouragement in her family, my family, that Bajaj has such a work ethic and a need for being educated. I would feel that the success of my family uh, would take the credit from there.
Yeah. I'm going to closure of our conversation by talking about two things which are again real issues that we face, not only as our society but more broadly globally, about not treating who we think are others properly, or from whatever angle somebody's other because they speak different language, they have a different color, they have a different nationality. And partition stories are just an example of how that human prejudice operates at different times in different periods, but underpinning issue is to think of oneself as one and the others as other, on whatever characteristics we may use of human existence. So you talk of a train coming from one side to another and then being returned with the same type of revenge to the other side. There's a very touching movement in the book. Would you like to narrate that? Although it's a very sad event, but I think if literature doesn't shake us, what will shake us? So why don't you talk a little bit about that event, and then we'll talk about Gandhi and Nehru before closure.
That chapter was based on the ghost train stories, the most famous aspect of partition, the ghastly trains that used to arrive packed with people stuffed inside the coaches and on the top of the trains, just wanting to get out of the respective country, be it India or Pakistan, and go to the country which would support their ethnicity. In the chapter, a Muslim man is waiting for his family to come home, but they are murdered on the train. And he is filled with a vengeance that perhaps does not account for religion, but uh, he does probably use religion as the excuse to commit the violence. And he takes his revenge by doing the very same atrocity, murdering a Sikh family and sending it on a train back to India. I think a lot of um, acts of religion violence that actually occurred were, some of them were personal, a lot of them were fanatic. And I think you have put it very beautifully, sir, that we have the partition's horrible events to reflect on, but still, even in today's world, we do have an instinctive way to just divide ourselves, either on the basis of nationality or the language we speak or the color of our skin. Perhaps those differences should not exist, and we should learn from the partition in that way.
Yeah. And indeed, now you mentioned in the last few chapters about assassination of Mahatma Gandhi and also Nehru's speech you referred to. So just reflect on those events as young person reading about those or finding about those events, what that meant for you, but also end with the hope that Padma shows towards the end.
A very interesting thing that came up in my research, which I had gotten from my family about Paki stories, was that the border between India and Pakistan was temporarily closed down after Gandhi's assassination due to the turmoil and the confusion. And coincidentally, at that point of time, my great grandfather had, after settling everybody down in India, he had gone back to Pakistan to fulfill his word to his employers that he will teach the new workers how to operate the machinery there. And this is one place where I had referred to mix the geopolitical aspect with our family story. And Gandhi's assassination played a very interesting role in the partition. The very fact that instinctively we decided to point fingers at the different religions while we call Mahatma Gandhi Bapu, the father of the nation as a whole. It was very interesting, I would say. And online archives also provided a very detailed explanation of what may have happened.
Yeah. So then now you end the story with Padma talking about trying to make a new home. So just a few concluding remarks on that.
My epilogue, I think, was my mother's favorite chapter, and I would like to talk a little bit about that. Um, this conversation is between a grandmother and her grandchildren. It's story time, and she tells that even after all that happened, finally, 40 years later, in a small town in Maharashtra, they have finally found home because home is where the family is. And this is a story of hope that even if they have lost a lot due to the partition, the uh, the family got back on its feet by staying together. And this is, I think, something you'll find with a lot of Sindhi families also. So if you would like to share something about your time in the Sindhi camp, that these we all stay together, and that's how we managed to get back up on our feet.
Yeah. So that's amazing. I think this has been such a good conversation, Isha, talking to you about your book and the way you have yourself appreciated a lot about the culture and heritage, but also as a writer, sharpened your art focused your art a bit more. And I think there is an excellent writer in making. Look forward to reading more from you. But also, I would like to encourage the listeners and viewers that please go out and get this book that is calling for reading. And you will just come to appreciate what this has done to lot of thousands of families who got displaced. And it may be a story not just of the Sindhis, but also of other peoples. It could be as well a story of a Sikh family or a Muslim family or a Hindu family or any, because whenever partition type of events happen, they displace societies, they displace families, and consequences can be very, very different for different families. And in many cases, they entail generations of struggle that follows, because once one is uprooted from the land where they have been settled for hundreds of years, and suddenly you are supposed to adjust in other places. So those historical events that triggered the partition and then displacement of Sindhis, along with many others, have created thousands of such stories. But it takes people like Isha to pick up those stories and bring them to life few generations down the line for us to appreciate. So thank you, Isha, for doing what you had done, and many congratulations on your publications.
Thank you, sir. But it's people like you who will tell these stories to us for us to write it down that will actually make sure that the Sindhi culture lives on.
Yes, I'm sure that will happen. Thank you for your time, and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, sir.